So a 4.8 magnitude earthquake hit New Jersey earlier today, and it was felt as far as Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and New York City, New York, and it even caused the Statue of Liberty to shake. So some evangelical Christians are claiming that this is a sign of the times. So is this a sign of the times? Well, that's what we're going to examine today. Hi, I'm the host, Stephanie Michelle. This is Sitra Achra, where we discuss the 3 taboos of politics, religion, and sex. So, the Georgia representative in Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene, today on X, formerly known as Twitter, she posted about the upcoming eclipse on Monday, April the 8th, and also this earthquake today on April the 5th, basically urging Americans to consider this as a sign of the times, to repent and to pray for the coming of Jesus. Here is her tweet. Of course, it wasn't just Christian nationalists and MAGA Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene who were involved in this messianic fervor today, but also it seems significant enough that both the New York Times and the New York Post ran articles on the subject. Here is the New York Times article, and here is the New York Post article. Now in the Bible, in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, and the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, Jesus does allegedly cite several different signs of the times. And one of them is earthquakes in diverse or various places. However, that is only according to the English translations, such as the King James Version. In the original Greek, it only states earthquakes in places. If you look at the original Greek of these passages, these 3 synoptic gospels, in parallel columns side by side, as is in the synopsis of the 4 gospels by Allen, which is based upon the Novum Testamentum Graece by Nessel Allen, then you can see what I'm talking about. Here's an image. Of course, there'll be some King James only people who will claim you're trying to take away from the Word of God, but that's not the case. Even the highly conservative Christian scholar, Dr. Frederick H.A. Scrivener, who wrote what he claimed to be the Textus Receptus, the Greek text behind the King James Version, and he was highly critical of the Westcott and Hort critical edition of the Greek, which relied upon the oldest Greek manuscripts such as Codex Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus. Even in his Greek text, you can see that that English word various, diverse is not there. Here is an image of Dr. Frederick H.A. Scrivener, as well as an image of his Greek text, which he claimed to be the Textus Receptus behind the King James Version. So here are the synoptic gospels in the original Greek. So as you can see, Mark 13:8 has seismoi katatopos, earthquakes upon places. Matthew 24:7 has the exact same phrase, seismoi katatopos, earthquakes upon places. The Gospel of Luke is a little bit different. Luke 21:11 has seismoi te megaloi, also great earthquakes. And there's a Greek variant, which we'll get to later when I examine the entire parallel passage, which has kai katatopos and upon places. So this is the Greek as it stands, at least in the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew, and kind of in the Gospel of Luke. Seismoi kata topos, earthquakes upon places or locations. So if the Greek actually read like the King James suggests, it would read something like this: Seismoi kata polaus topos, earthquakes upon diverse or various places, locations. Of course, there's the matter of whether or not we should be trying to apply biblical prophecy to current events altogether anyways. This has been highly criticized by academic biblical scholars such as Dr. Bart Ehrman, Dr. James Tabor, and Dr. Dan McClellan, just to name a few. However, I personally do think there's an argument to be made that biblical prophecy and other prophecies can be legitimate in regards to things such as astrology and tarot card readings. However, they need to be properly interpreted, and that's a topic for another video altogether. Nonetheless, some evangelicals are claiming that this earthquake today was a great earthquake, and they're citing the Gospel of Luke chapter 21 as their justification. However, although it is historically accurate to say that this earthquake was a great earthquake in regards to the state of New Jersey, since we haven't had a 4.8 magnitude earthquake in that area since colonial times before it was even a state, we cannot state this in regards to earthquakes globally. For instance, there was the recent earthquake in Taiwan, which was a 7.4 magnitude earthquake. Here are the headlines from the New York Times comparing the two events. Here is an image of the earthquake destruction in Taiwan, which is arguably worse than that suffered in New Jersey today. Another point of interest with this earthquake today and its close proximity to the upcoming total solar eclipse on Monday is the fact that the Statue of Liberty itself was struck by lightning earlier this week. So, of course, some evangelicals have speculated that the United States of America, especially the harbor port city of New York City, and its Statue of Liberty are somehow connected to the Book of Revelation and Lady Babylon. But this is a topic for an entire different video. However, I do want to show the image of the Statue of Liberty being struck by lightning. In my opinion, however, the point of most interest is that the epicenter of this 4.8 magnitude earthquake in New Jersey today was near the Trump National Golf Club located in Bedminster, which Donald Trump purchased back in 2002, which was opened in 2004, and which hosted the marriage of Donald Trump's daughter Ivanka Trump to Jared Kushner in 2009. So I would argue that Donald Trump is probably the best candidate for the Antichrist today, and that Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner are probably the best candidate for the false prophet. It's two horns today. However, that is a topic for another video altogether, and is one that I need to be very explicit about, because a lot of people would criticize it heavily from both sides, from a liberal side and a conservative side, and from conservative biblical scholarship and critical academic biblical scholarship. Here is an image of the Trump National Golf Club, located in Bedminster, New Jersey, the epicenter of the earthquake today. Here are some images demonstrating its location. Again, as I stated earlier in this video, there's great contention on whether or not we can apply biblical prophecy or prophecy whatsoever altogether to current events today. However, I would argue that astrology is the exception to this rule, but again, that is a topic for another video altogether. At this point, I just want to briefly state that I agree with one of the opinions of the Talmud in Tractate Shabbos 75a, that Deuteronomy 4:6 refers to astrology as being the wisdom that is in the visible sight of all the nations of the world. Lastly, before I move on to analyzing the parallel Greek texts, I want to try to briefly answer the question which I set forth at the beginning of this video, which is, was this earthquake today one of the signs of the times? And I would answer briefly, yes, potentially I think that it was, but I want to clarify this answer. First of all, I want to state that I think the evidence is that Jesus was probably a historical person. However, I personally do not believe that he was the Son of God, that he was literally equal to God. However, I do think maybe he was a Messiah, but if he was a Messiah, he was probably a failed Messiah, but a significant Messiah nonetheless. So as a Jew myself, a mystical Jew, a Kabbalist, I personally do not have much trouble in looking at Jesus as a failed Messiah from a mystical standpoint who is also significant. That said, I think it is difficult for us to discern which sayings we can actually attribute historically to Jesus. But I think that we need to look at the Bible as we do all of ancient history. We need to presume that there is probably a kernel of historical truth, also mixed with a lot of mythology and legend, or what's called in Judaism, Achra. Now in the Gospel of Mark chapter 13 and the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, but not in the Gospel of Luke chapter 21, Jesus allegedly says that these are simply the beginning of birth pangs. So even if we see these signs, these type of signs have happened for 2,000 years now. Wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, famines, pestilences, even signs in the heavens, as Luke adds. This has all happened many times before. But I think there is a sign that Jesus mentions later. Now, this sign, I believe, is the parable of the fig tree, which is also mentioned later in the Gospel of Mark chapter 13, the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, and the Gospel of Luke chapter 21, although there's many different variations of it in these synoptic Gospels. And the parable of the fig tree is another topic which deserves its own video altogether. However, I do want to mention a few brief things. First, some of the earlier dispensationalists, such as Hal Lindsey, claim that the parable of the fig tree referred to the rebirth of Israel on a single day, as Isaiah chapter 66 suggests, on May 14th, 1948. However, Jesus in the Gospels expressly states that the generation that witnesses this will not pass away before he returns. And obviously 40 years since 1948 has come and gone, so that cannot be the fulfillment of this prophecy. Perhaps rather, the parable of the fig tree applies to the reoccupation of Jerusalem by Israel in 1967. But again, 40 years has come and gone since 1967 as well. So far, all of these attempts to apply the parable of the fig tree to modern current events have proven to be failed prophecy. And perhaps it's just doomed to always be failed prophecy, and it's just simply nonsense as academic biblical scholars claim. I am convinced, however, that academic biblical scholars suffer from the same misconception of prophecy as do fundamentalist biblical scholars. The Bible doesn't seem to suggest that prophecy is perfect. In fact, Numbers chapter 12 seems to indicate that there's various levels of prophesying, with Moses being at the top. And 1 Samuel chapter 10 also seems to suggest that God doesn't come upon the prophets and overwhelm them, but rather the prophets cause themselves to prophesy, kind of like using the Force in the Star Wars mythos of George Lucas. There does seem to be precedence in the Bible that the symbol of the fig represents abundance for the nation of Israel. For example, Micah chapter 4. And I think it's perhaps significant that in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus rides into Jerusalem and he's rejected by the Jewish leadership. And then he goes outside of Jerusalem, curses a fig tree that wasn't even ripe in season. And I think this becomes a symbol for the rejection of Jerusalem, The nation of Israel, yes, but specifically the Temple of Solomon. Therefore, I would argue that perhaps the best interpretation of a fulfillment for the parable of the fig tree, if there is such a thing, is that it represents a generation that will witness the rebuilding, the 7-year rebuilding of a Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, in Israel, and that this is the ultimate sign that you're living in the last days. Until then, it's just simply wars and rumors of wars, pestilence, famine, etc., birth pangs of the Messiah. However, I would not be dogmatic about this because I don't think prophecy is meant to be, again, predictive in its exactness. It's meant to be fluid and therefore due to error. So I may be wrong about this, but I think if you see a temple being rebuilt today, then it's probably the end times. Now, I would even go so far as to say that it's a bit disturbing how close we seem to be to the Jews rebuilding the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem today. I mean, temple activist groups like the Temple Mount Faithful and the Temple Institute have been trying to rebuild the temple since the mid-1980s. And previous intifadas and the current war in Gaza, because of the Hamas attacks on Israel on October 7th, they all began because of these temple activists in Israel. So we've never been closer in 2,000 years to the Jews rebuilding a temple. And so I'd say this is the sign. This is the sign. Now I should probably also mention the restoration of the red heifer offering, which may happen on Passover at the end of the month, which hasn't happened in 2,000 years and which has mystical, Kabbalistic significance, as well as, I believe, significance for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. However, again, this is a topic that deserves its own video altogether. So to wrap up this video, this episode of Sitra Achra, I'm going to examine the parallel gospel accounts, the synoptic gospel accounts of Mark chapter 13, Matthew chapter 24, and Luke chapter 21. So let's examine this text in the original Greek. So I put the three synoptic gospels into parallel columns. The red demonstrates how the other two synoptics, Matthew and Luke, are basically borrowing from the earliest of the canonical gospels, the Gospel of Mark. So the first part of the passage of Mark 13:7 through 8 states, Hotan de akausete, with a variant in the Codex Vaticanus, which is akoete, which is probably a scribal mistake. I'll get to that in a minute. If we move on to Matthew, you can see that he basically changed it. But if we move on to Luke, he basically just copied it word for word. Hotan de akausete. See, Hotan de akausete, Hotan de akausete, which basically translates as and or but when you shall hear. So, and or but when you shall hear. Now this variant in the Codex Vaticanus, one of the earliest Greek manuscripts, has akoete, which basically probably means you shall, or you hear instead of you shall hear. So as you can see, the top akoete with the heta instead of akoete with the epsilon probably is, the second one is the correct word that was meant to be used. Now all of these terms have the root of akao, and akao basically means to hear or to listen. So it's possible that Matthew's Achaean is closer to that root Achao, which is similar to the Codex Vaticanus version of Mark, which is Achaete. So Matthew has Melisete de Achaean, which is basically but as you shall begin to or delay to hear. So in the next part of the passage, Matthew copies directly from Mark, but Luke changes it somewhat, even though he seems to be aware of Mark as well as Matthew. So Mark has Polemos kai aquas polemon, wars and rumors of wars, which you can see Matthew has the same, Polemos kai aquas polemon, wars and rumors of wars. Whereas you can see Luke changes it. He has Polemos kai akastastasias, which is wars and instability. In the next section of the passage, both Matthew and Luke change Mark, but Matthew only slightly, at least apart from this variant in Mark. And remember that Mark is the earliest gospel, so there seems to be more variance in some of those manuscripts because Mark seems to have gone through quite a bit of reduction. So in this next section, Mark has me throis they, so basically be not troubled. But the Codex Bezae has a variant of thorobeste, and Codex Bezae is also an early Greek manuscript, which seems to have a lot more Hebraicisms. In this case, it's like be not agitated. So if we look at Matthew, he has horate me throeste. So the me throeste is the same as Mark, be not troubled. But he adds horate, behold, be not troubled, putting more emphasis upon it. And then when we get to Luke, the only thing that's the same is may, not, which he may be borrowing, he may not. It's hard to say. And then it has toite, so be not terrified. However, in Codex Bezae, there is this variant of phobethete, which is be not panicked. So again, as I mentioned, these hearing of wars and rumors of wars are fairly regular events. And so the next part of the passage demonstrates that this is not necessarily a sign of the end times. However, it could be a sign that we are closer to the end times. So let me explain. So now we're getting to the point of what I'm saying. So this, in Mark, be not troubled or be not agitated. In Matthew, behold, be not troubled. Or in Luke, be not terrified or be not panicked. It's really this idea of what the next part of the passage is going to say. So in Mark, there's a textual variant, which makes it almost identical to Matthew. And Matthew is basically copying Mark. So Matthew has de garganiste al alpo estin totelos. Indeed, it must happen, but the end is not yet. So Matthew adds estin, and that's the only thing he adds, which basically is just better Greek because it has to be inferred, is estin. In Mark, it has to be inferred. Mark has de geneste o opo totelos. However, in the textual variants of Codex Sinaiticus, in one of its scribal editions,
Codex Alexandrinus and Codex Bizai, it has Gar, which is indeed, which if you add this, it's again almost identical to Matthew, except for he adds better Greek with este. Now Luke changes this fairly significantly, although it is pretty evident that he knows Mark. So he has Degar tata geneste al eutheos totelos. So he has indeed these must happen, but the end is not soon, whereas Matthew and Mark have, but the end is not yet. And again, Luke is writing probably the latest of the Synoptic Gospels, although Matthew and Luke have some portions which are probably older than Mark, but for the most part, Mark's the earliest, and then Matthew, and then Luke, and then finally John, although John also has some portions which are probably older than even Mark, or at least as old as Mark. So not soon is probably added by Mark simply because, you know, the coming of Jesus was delayed. Paul the Apostle expected it in his lifetime, and when he died, Jesus still hadn't returned. So the Advent hadn't happened, and therefore he adds this. It's not even soon. It's not yet, but I mean, it's not even soon.
So now we'll have a look at the rest of this passage, especially because the version in Luke kind of applies directly to the stuff today.
So the version in Luke begins with a section which is not extant in Mark or Matthew. So it has Tota elegan autois. Then he said to them. The next section is the same in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, except for Matthew kind of changes one of the words slightly. So in the original Mark, it's egerthesete gar ethnos ep ethnos. Indeed, nation shall arise against nation. And we'll skip over to Luke first. So in Luke it has egerthesete gar ethnos ep ethnos. The only thing with Luke is the gar, indeed, is only found in Codex Bizai. Otherwise, it's slightly different than Mark. In Matthew, he changes ep to epi, so it still means essentially the same thing against, it's just he chooses a different iteration of it, whereas Luke copied Mark with ep exactly. The next section is exactly the same in all three synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. So in Matthew it reads, Kai basileia epi basileon, and kingdom shall be against kingdom. So exactly the same in Matthew, Kai basileia epi basileon, and exactly the same in Luke, Kai basileia epi basileon. The next section requires some explanation. In the different variations in the Greek manuscripts, it's essentially the same, but Mark adds a little bit, Matthew changes the order, and Luke adds some significant additions, which we'll get to in a moment, since it has pertinence to some of what happened today with the earthquake. So Mark has Kai, Esantai, Seismoi, Kata, Topos, Esantai, Limoi. Kai and is added only in Codex Alexandrinus, which is another early Greek manuscript. Esantai, there shall be seismoi, earthquakes, kata, upon, topos, places. Esantai, there shall be limoi, famine. Going to Matthew, it's essentially the same, but he changes the order. So Kai, Esantai, limoi, Kai, seismoi, kata, topos. So he has the famine first and then the earthquakes. And there shall be famine and earthquakes upon places. Luke is a little more significant, as I stated. He has seismoi, te megaloi, and then in the Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Beze, and Codex Washingtonionis, it has kai kata topos. And then we have limoi kai loimoi isantai phobetra te. And then we'll get to the section in a second. So basically what his says is seismoi earthquakes, also great, so also great earthquakes. Megaloi, seismoi, great earthquakes really seems to be what people today, especially in like Pennsylvania, are claiming that this earthquake in New Jersey that affected also New York City was a great earthquake, and it kind of was. 4.8 magnitude was great for that area, but not really great in concerns to earthquakes across the globe. So anyways, we'll get to that later as well. Limoi, famine, and pestilence. So he adds pestilence, and he also adds also terror, phobetra. Now I want to focus a little bit more upon Luke's version, because he has seismoi te megaloi, also great earthquakes. And so he adds great to earthquakes from Matthew and Mark. So some people in Pennsylvania were claiming that this earthquake today was a great earthquake. And it's kind of true, but it needs some clarification. As a 4.8 magnitude earthquake, it was great for the area, being New Jersey, which also affected parts of like New York City. However, it's not really a great earthquake in regards to earthquakes across the globe. So I wanted to make that clarification. Now, he also has kai kata topos, but only in Codex Alexandrinus, Beze, and Washingtonianus, which are also 3 ancient Greek manuscripts. However, the kai kata topos places it similar to the versions in Mark and Matthew. Otherwise, if it's not there, it's not quite the same. He also adds loimoi, pestilence, to limoi, famine. So limoi kai loimoi isantai, there shall be famine and pestilence. And he adds phobetra te, also terror, which Matthew and Mark do not have. However, if we go back to Mark, in Codex Alexandrinus and Washingtonianus, it adds kai tarakai and disturbance. So there does seem to be some precedence for an additional aspect to this. Now, Luke's version adds in a completely different way than Mark and Matthew, which are both pretty similar. So I'm going to start with Luke's version first. So it has kai up orano semea megala estai. So, and from heaven great signs there shall be. The kai up orano seme megala estai phrase, however, only appears in Codex Alexandrinus and Codex Washingtonianus. However, these signs from heaven seem to be being applied, especially by people in Pennsylvania today, to this upcoming solar eclipse in regards to the alleged great earthquakes. As for Mark's ending of this section, he has arche wodinon tata. Beginning birth pangs are these. So these are the beginning of birth pangs. However, there's a variant in Codex Alexandrinus, which is arche, beginnings plural rather than arche, beginning singular. And Matthew pretty much has the same thing. However, he has Panta Datata in the Codex Washingtonianus, which is and or but, all these. And then he has arche wodenon, which is basically the same as in Mark, arche wodenon. These are beginnings of birth pangs, basically. However, the tata would not be in the original if not for Washingtonianus. So it would just be beginning birth pangs, kind of a weird statement without the these are.